When you picture the history of the American Midwest, you probably imagine a wholesome postcard painted in shades of golden wheat and hopeful, vibrant green. We all know that iconic logo of the leaping deer stamped on the side of those massive machines, a symbol that screams stability, good old-fashioned family values, and the quiet dignity of farm life. But let me spill the tea. The true origin story of the John Deere empire isn't about stability at all. It is a scandalous tale fueled by absolute unadulterated panic. This isn't a story that starts with some wealthy tycoon calmly surveying his empire. It begins with a terrified man shaking in his boots. We are talking about a guy fleeing into the dark of night, barely staying one desperate step ahead of the long arm of the law. The massive brand that would eventually feed the entire planet was actually forged in the chaotic fires of a dirty criminal escape. Let's rewind to the autumn of 1836, where the town of Rutland, Vermont, was a freezing, unforgiving nightmare for a guy with empty pockets. John Deere was 32 years old, a wildly talented blacksmith with hands of steel and a sharp mind. But here is the kicker. He was also a man drowning in massive debt. The American economy had completely collapsed. Businesses were shuttering left and right, and the local creditors. They were done listening to empty promises. In those days, failing to pay your bills wasn't just a financial oopsie. It was a straight-up criminal offence that could ruin your life. The terrifying shadow of the debtor's prison was looming over the Deere household like a curse. It was a bleak, stone-cold reality that threatened to swallow him whole. The decision he made on that crisp November evening was brutal, totally desperate, and absolutely necessary for his survival. With the sheriff reportedly on his way to slap the cuffs on him, John Deere didn't stand his ground. He turned tail and ran. He packed a tiny bag with his few remaining tools and, get this, kissed his wife Demarius, who was heavily pregnant with their third child, goodbye. Then he slipped out the back door like a thief. He ghosted his family, leaving them to face the shame and the angry mob of creditors, all alone promising to send for them only if he survived the wild. He was officially a fugitive, a man stripped of his good name, heading west into the vast, terrifying unknown of the dangerous American frontier. He hit the road with only $73 in his pocket and an active warrant out for his arrest. His runaway journey landed him in a tiny, dusty settlement in Illinois, ironically called Grand Detour. The name itself was a cruel joke for a man who'd been forced to take the ultimate detour from his own messy life. The town was barely a town, just a collection of rough cabins huddled against the Rock River, a place where civilization was fighting a losing battle against the elements. It was right here in the mud and the isolation that the fugitive blacksmith decided to set up his forge and start over. He hoped to just disappear, to hammer out a quiet, low-profile living, making horseshoes and fixing shovels for the local settlers without getting caught. But he quickly realised that the farmers of Illinois were fighting a battle way harder than his own legal drama. The Midwest was supposed to be the promised land, right? The soil was rich black and incredibly fertile, a stark, beautiful contrast to the rocky grey mess back in Vermont. But there was a nasty curse hidden deep in that ground. The soil was heavy, sticky, and had the consistency of thick, impossible gumbo. The farmers had dragged their old cast-iron ploughs from back east, but out here, those ploughs were total trash. The black earth would stick to the pitted surface of the iron like superglue, completely clogging the blade every few feet. A farmer would have to stop his team of oxen, scrape the mud off the plough with a wooden paddle, and walk a few more painful yards. Then stop again. It was back-breaking, soul-crushing labour that was destroying them. Men were literally giving up. They were packing their wagons and retreating back east, defeated by the very dirt that was supposed to make them rich and famous. John Deere watched this disaster from the door of his shop. He saw the exhaustion in the men's faces. He saw the despair of families starving while sitting on top of the best soil in the world. And his blacksmith brain began to spin. He realised that the problem wasn't the dirt at all. The villain in this story was the metal. Cast iron was too rough. It held onto the soil like a bad ex. He needed something way smoother. He needed something that would slice through that sticky earth like a hot knife through butter. He needed steel and the breakthrough. It happened by total accident or maybe destiny. In 1837, while visiting a local sawmill, Deere spotted a broken steel saw blade that had been tossed in the corner like garbage. In that jagged piece of scrap metal, he saw the future. He grabbed that blade and took it back to his secret shop. He heated it in the forge until it glowed a dull, angry red. He hammered it, bent it and polished it until it shone like a vanity mirror. He wasn't just making a tool, folks. He was crafting a miracle solution to save the Midwest. He attached the curved steel blade to a wooden handle and took it out to a neighbour's field for the ultimate vibe check. The result was pure magic. The polished steel scoured itself as it moved through the earth. The sticky black mud slid right off the metal. The plough sang as it cut a clean, perfect furrow across the prairie. It was the very first self-polishing steel plough in history, and it changed the game forever. In that split second, John Deere ceased to be a fugitive blacksmith and transformed into the saviour of the American West. He had unlocked the potential of the breadbasket. He had essentially handed the farmers the key to the vault. But let's be real, success for John Deere was not a release from his inner demons. It was merely a change in their form. The fear of poverty, the trauma of the sheriff knocking at the door in Vermont never truly left him. It mutated into relentless, driving perfectionism. He became obsessed with quality, haunted by his past until the very end. He was living in a constant state of panic, terrified that one single mistake with a plough would bring his entire house of cards crashing down and send him straight back to debtor's prison. He famously dropped that iconic line to his business partners, swearing, "I will never slap my name on a product that doesn't represent the absolute best of what's inside me." It sounds like some noble, high-minded corporate slogan, but let's be real for Deere. It was strictly a defense mechanism to keep the critics at bay. It was the desperate mantra of a man running on fear and adrenaline, realizing that as his fame exploded, his tiny shop in Grand Detour was way too small to contain the hype. The isolation that once kept him safe was now strangling his business, and he realized he needed a major upgrade, specifically a river, to transport his heavy steel. He desperately needed a railroad connection, so in 1848 he made the boss move to relocate his entire operation to Moline, Illinois, sitting pretty on the banks of the Mississippi River. This relocation wasn't just a move. It marked the official launch of a massive industrial empire. He constructed a beast of a factory, a cathedral of noise and smoke where the hammers rang out non-stop, and finally sent for his estranged family to join him. Demarius and the kids, including his son Charles, finally reunited with him, stepping out of the shadows to realise they were no longer the family of a broke criminal. They had transformed overnight into the undisputed royalty of this river town, but the dark cloud of their scandalous past refused to clear. John Deere was a hardened man forged in the fire of his forge and the chill of his escape, and he raised his kids in the grim shadow of the factory rather than a life of leisure. The business became the family's cult-like religion, and that steel plough was the altar they worshipped at every single day. The real tragedy of this origin story is baked right into the family DNA. John might have saved the American farmer, but he basically enslaved his own kin to the brand. He drilled it into their heads that survival required constant grueling vigilance and taught them that taking a break was dangerous weakness. He hammered out a work ethic that was as tough and unforgiving as his steel, but he completely forgot to add any warmth or affection to the mix. As he aged, swapping his leather apron for a tailored suit, he laid the groundwork for a dynasty that would eventually rule the industry. A dynasty that would possess unimaginable wealth but find absolutely zero peace of mind. The fugitive blacksmith had stopped running, but the paranoia never left him. He built that factory as a guarantee he'd never taste poverty again. But in the process, he birthed a corporate monster that would demand to be fed by every single generation that followed him. The legendary Green Machine was born, but the ticket price was a life shackled to the grindstone with no hope of escape. And waiting in the wings was his son, Charles Deere, a young man who soaked up his father's struggles and would eventually turn that anxiety into a fortress of brick and stone. The original blacksmith had managed to survive the brutal wilderness. But the true cost of this empire was about to be paid by the son, who would choose to build his home directly above the toxic smoke. When Old Man Deere finally put down his hammer and passed into history, he left behind a legacy heavy enough to crush anyone with a weaker spine. But make no mistake, his son Charles Deere was not some weak link in the chain. He was a totally different animal. If the dad was the artist moulding steel, the son was the 4-star general commanding an army. Charles didn't have the rough, calloused hands of a craftsman like his father. He had the icy, calculating stare of a ruthless tycoon taking his dad's successful hustle and turning it into an unstoppable industrial juggernaut. Under his command, the company stopped being a local quirky shop and morphed into a global monopoly, a leviathan devouring every competitor in sight. It completely dominated the American landscape, crushing everything in its path. In 1872, Charles decided the Plough King needed a castle, but the spot he picked exposes the dark, obsessive heart of the Deere family drama. Your average Gilded Age billionaire would have built their mega mansion far away from the action, miles away from the deafening noise and the filth of the manufacturing district. The Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers built their summer getaways in Newport or the Hudson Valley, creating massive green buffers to hide the source of their dirty money. They desperately wanted to forget how the sausage was made. Charles Deere, he wanted to watch the sausage being made while he ate his filet mignon. He picked a steep bluff in Moline, a limestone ridge looming right over the sprawling factory complex, and aptly named the estate Overlook. That name wasn't poetry, it was a literal description of the house's creepy primary purpose. Charles hired top-tier architects to build a massive Swiss-style mansion with 7,000 square feet of living space, soaring ceilings, and crazy intricate woodwork. It was a stunning crib stuffed with the most expensive furniture and art that money could buy. But the way the house was positioned was straight up bizarre. It was designed with giant windows facing down the hill, staring unblinkingly at the forest of smokestacks belching cold smoke. This wasn't a home, it was a guard tower. Charles treated his pad like a panopticon, a command centre where he could spy on his empire 24 hours a day. He'd stand at the window of his study, coffee in hand, watching the morning shift workers file in through the gates like little ants. He would obsessively watch the colour of the smoke rising from the foundry, looking for any sign of trouble. If that chimney smoke was pumping out thick and black, Charles Deere was living his best life knowing the furnaces were blazing hot and production was absolutely killing it. But the second that smoke started to thin out, or God forbid disappear completely, he knew there was major drama brewing, and you bet he'd be screaming into the telephone or storming down that hill to fire someone within minutes. The man literally did not understand the concept of work-life balance because in his mind they were the exact same thing. The factory was the beating heart pumping the blood, and he was just addicted to the pulse. That massive mansion was really just the brain meant to direct the chaos, meaning that living at Overlook was basically like setting up a penthouse apartment inside a grinding industrial machine. The vibe at the estate wasn't some peaceful countryside fantasy. It was a constant rhythmic assault of industrial violence that would drive a normal person absolutely insane. Those massive trip hammers pounding steel down in the factory didn't just make noise. They created a literal tremor that shot up the limestone bluff and shook the house's foundation like an earthquake. We are talking about delicate, expensive crystal glasses in the dining room cupboards, shivering and clinking together in perfect time with the stamping machines, which is honestly a terrifying soundtrack for dinner. The entire family had to eat their gourmet meals to the heartbeat of the factory, never allowed to forget for 1 second where the money for the steak was coming from. Silence was totally non-existent at Overlook. There was only the dull, relentless roar of American capitalism doing its dirty work in the background of every single conversation. And then, of course, we have to talk about the soot, because back in the late 19th century, environmental regulations were basically a myth that nobody had invented yet. The John Deere factory was burning through literal tons of coal every single day, and all that toxic smoke didn't just magically vanish into the ether, it went straight up. And because the genius architects plunked Overlook right on the ridge directly above those spewing chimneys, the family mansion was sitting right in the splash zone of all that pollution. Those pristine white linens imported all the way from Europe would turn a tragic shade of grey within hours of hitting the tables, while the velvet drapes soaked up that gross, acrid scent of burning coal like a sponge. The poor maids were fighting an eternal losing war against the foundry dust that coated every windowsill and banister, a glamorous battle against grime that they had zero chance of winning. For a tycoon like Charles Deere, breathing in that filthy atmosphere was better than perfume because it was the undeniable smell of massive success. He inhaled that cold smoke like it was fresh mountain air, but for his wife, Mary, and their daughters, that house was nothing but a gilded cage suspended inside a toxic cloud of smog. Sure, they were wealthy beyond your wildest imagination, essentially serving as the untouchable royalty of the Illinois social scene with all the clout that comes with it. They jetted off to Europe, wore the finest silk gowns and hosted parties that were the talk of the town, but they could never actually scrub off the gritty physical reality of the business that paid for it all. It is the ultimate irony of the ultra-rich. The source of their incredible privilege was also the exact source of their disgusting pollution. They were trapped in this toxic feedback loop of production and consumption, living in a mansion that was literally shaking from the sheer force of the money being printed down the hill. Living in that kind of intense proximity bred a very specific, almost twisted kind of psychology within the Deere family circle that outsiders couldn't comprehend. They developed this intense sense of duty that honestly bordered on martyrdom. They didn't see themselves as just owners cashing checks. They acted like sacred stewards of the brand. They could physically feel the weight of thousands of men sweating in the heat below, and they constantly felt the judgmental eyes of the entire town staring up at their castle on the hill. Charles Deere was the ultimate demanding patriarch, a total control freak who expected his family to maintain a standard of rigid perfection that would make a drill sergeant cry. The man was efficient, serious, and utterly consumed by the company. He didn't believe in hobbies or fun diversions. His entire personality was just the plough. As the years dragged on, that house morphed into a physical manifestation of Charles's complete inability to let go of control or just chill out for 5 minutes. He kept expanding the estate, adding more rooms, more gardens, and building higher walls, but he refused to change the view because he was obsessed with watching those fires burn. He needed to hear that factory whistle like an addict needs a fix, which proves that Overlook was built to show off his mastery over the land, but it backfired completely. Instead, it proved that the land and that monstrous factory had total mastery over him, revealing that the wealthiest man in the region was actually just a servant to his own assets. He was a prisoner of his own creation, essentially tethered to that window day and night, watching the smoke rise like he was guarding the crown jewels. He was absolutely terrified that if he looked away, even for a split second, the fire might go out and his empire would crumble into dust. By the time Charles Deere was approaching the series finale of his life, the estate was a local landmark and a symbol of industrial power. But inside those walls, the vibes were heavy and suffocating. Any joy the family experienced was constantly filtered through the gritty screen of the business, tainted by the relentless pressure to perform. Charles had forged a company of steel, but in the process, he forged a life of iron-hard discipline that left absolutely zero room for softness or actual human emotion. He had built himself a dream mansion where the walls vibrated non-stop and the air tasted like sulphur, which sounds more like a nightmare than a luxury home. And as he prepared to pass this heavy burden to the next generation, he ensured that his daughter and her husband wouldn't just inherit a massive fortune, they were inheriting that cursed view. They would inherit the constant noise, the pollution, and the crushing obligation to stand at that window and watch the smoke just like he did. They were forever bound to the machine churning below. The blacksmith's fugitive run was over, but the marathon of the Deere dynasty was just kicking off and the finish line was nowhere in sight. In 1907, the iron heart of Charles Deere finally stopped beating, marking the end of the original power player's reign. This was the man who had single-handedly turned a humble blacksmith shop into a global empire that dominated the market. The man who had lived his entire existence in the shadow of those smokestacks finally collapsed under the crushing weight of his own massive ambition. He left behind a company that was the absolute envy of the industrial world, a fortune so staggering it's hard to count, and that house on the hill that sat there watching it all unfold. But here is the plot twist. He did not leave behind a son to take the throne, meaning the name Deere in the direct male line had officially run its course. The massive burden of the legacy now shifted squarely onto the shoulders of his daughter Catherine, and more specifically the man she had married, William Wiman. This transition marked the premiere of the Deere Wiman House era, a period where the estate transformed from a strategic command post into a high-stakes pressure cooker ready to explode. William Wiman was not just a capable man, he was a force to be reckoned with in the high-stakes game of industry. A man possessing sharp intelligence and relentless drive, yet he suffered from one fatal flaw. He wasn't born of the fire and the forge. He had simply married into the royal monarchy of Moline. He was the prince consort attempting to step into the massive boots of a giant, and let me tell you, the pressure on him was immediate, crushing and absolute. He wasn't just running a business, he was managing an empire. He found himself appointed the custodian of a living legend, suddenly responsible for the livelihood and survival of an entire city's population. The judgmental eyes of thousands of workers, the greedy eyes of the shareholders, and the ghostly watching eyes of the old blacksmith himself were all fixed intently upon him. Desperate to prove his worth, William threw himself into the work with a manic energy that mirrored the founder's legendary flight from Vermont decades prior. He tried to embody the general that Charles had been haunting the executive offices and pacing the gritty factory floors like a man possessed. He lived in that imposing mansion on the hill, constantly staring down at the sprawling beast of industry that demanded to be fed day and night. But here is the tragic reality. The beast was insatiable and always hungry, while William was merely mortal flesh and blood. The toxic strain of managing the colossal John Deere company, the endless vicious battles with labour unions, the volatile rollercoaster markets, and the crushing expectation of absolute perfection began to rapidly erode his health. He was essentially a single man trying to hold back a tidal wave with nothing but a garden shovel. Then the bombshell dropped in 1906, just a year before Charles Deere officially passed away. The stress claimed its first major victim. William Wiman dropped dead at the shockingly young age of 44. He didn't die in some gruesome factory accident, and he certainly didn't die of old age. He was ground down into dust by the relentless friction of the responsibility he had inherited. The infamous curse of the plough had claimed another soul for its collection. He had been handed the keys to the ultimate kingdom, but the crown was so incredibly heavy that it literally broke his neck. He left behind Catherine, a devastated widow with 2 young sons, trapped in a massive house that vibrated constantly with the noise of the very machinery that had killed her husband. The estate, now officially branded the Deere Wiman House, transformed into a place of tragic grandeur, but Catherine Deere Wiman proved she was a woman of immense fortitude, a true daughter of the Iron Titan. She didn't flee to the Riviera, she didn't cash out and sell the company to the highest bidder. Instead, she groomed her sons, Charles Deere Wiman and Dwight Wiman, to understand the terrified gravity of their last name, expanding the house until it became even more opulent and imposing. The gardens were manicured to absolute perfection, while servants in starched uniforms moved silently through the halls like ghosts in a haunted palace. But the underlying frequency of the home remained the same. It was a glittering golden cage suspended precariously above an active volcano. The focus of the tragedy now narrowed its lens to the eldest son, Charles Deere Wiman, named ominously after the grandfather who built the house. He was the chosen one, the golden child. From the moment he took his first breath, his destiny was welded to him, and he was never allowed to be just a boy. He was the heir apparent, growing up in the nursery at Overlook with the weight of the world already on his small shoulders. He listened to the factory whistle blow every day, knowing with dread that one day he would be the one pulling that cord. Just imagine the twisted psychological landscape of growing up in that house. You are a child surrounded by a level of wealth that most people can only dream of in their wildest fantasies. You have ponies, you have private tutors, you have the finest clothes, but every time you look out your bedroom window, you see a sky blackened by industrial soot. Every time you sit down to a gourmet dinner, you feel the subtle tremor in the floorboards as the massive drop hammers pound the steel down the hill. You are brainwashed to believe that the men sweating in the heat below are your personal responsibility. You are taught from birth that the family honour depends entirely on the quality of a single ploughshare. It is a childhood defined by extreme privilege, yes, but it is also a childhood of extreme cult-like indoctrination. Charles Deere Wiman was bred to be a ruthlessly efficient industrialist in the same way a thoroughbred racehorse is bred to run for the roses. When he finally seized control of the company, he was the perfect synthesis of the two bloodlines he possessed, the Deere grit and the Wiman sensitivity. He moved into the master suite of the house on the hill, claiming the throne. He occupied the very same rooms where his grandfather had watched the smoke rise and where his father had worried himself into an early grave. The vibe of the house in the 1920s was one of frantic, desperate luxury. The jazz age was in full swing and the parties at the Deere Wiman estate were the stuff of legend. Champagne flowed like water and music drifted out over the limestone bluff, but beneath the glossy surface, the tension was thick and palpable. The family was trapped in a gilded yoke, functioning as the oxen pulling the cart of the entire American economy. They could not stop and they could not step aside. To sell the company would be a treasonous betrayal of the blood, and to let it fail would be a mortal sin. So they worked themselves to the bone, and Charles Deere Wiman became a total workaholic, driven by the same demons that had chased his great-grandfather. He paced the floors of the library late into the night, unable to find peace. The light of his cigar, glowing in the darkness, mirrored the hellish glow of the foundry fires below. He was the master of the house, but in reality, he was a servant to the legacy. The true tragedy of this era of the estate is the complete loss of autonomy. The Deere Wiman family had everything money could buy except for the one thing that mattered: the freedom to walk away. The house was beautiful, filled with priceless art and culture, but it was essentially just a high-end dormitory for the factory management to sleep in between shifts. Let's be real for a second, those perfectly manicured lawns and breathtaking views were just a glamorous mask hiding a gritty industrial nightmare that defined their existence. The entire family didn't just own the business, they existed solely to serve the unyielding machine. You could say they were the high priests of a twisted religion built on steel and smoke, and that massive imposing house on the hill was their unholy temple. As the years dragged on, that bizarre physical connection between their luxury home and the grimy factory became the ultimate symbol of their gilded cage, a trap they built themselves. In most ultra-wealthy dynasties, the third generation usually takes the money and runs to the city or the coast to get soft on champagne and caviar. But the Deere Wimans, they were obsessed. They stayed right there on the bluff, breathing in the soot. They refused to leave the noise and the filth, clinging to it with a stubborn, gritty kind of loyalty that frankly bordered on some dark form of masochism. They simply refused to separate themselves from the source of their immense power, even as it extracted a brutal, heavy toll on their personal happiness and mental health. The house stood there like a cold monument to crushing duty, a place where fathers worked themselves to death young, and sons were drafted into the brutal war of commerce before they were even old enough to shave their faces. That legendary green machine might have been feeding the world, but behind closed doors it was slowly consuming the very family that created it, piece by piece. And just as the Roaring Twenties came to a screeching, crashing halt and the dark, ominous clouds of the Great Depression began to gather on the horizon, the drama reached a fever pitch. Charles Deere Wiman would find himself standing at that very same window, staring down at the silent smokestacks, facing a catastrophic threat that could destroy absolutely everything his ancestors had built. The fortress on the hill was about to be besieged by poverty all over again, and the tension inside those walls was thick enough to cut with a knife. It brings the whole scandalous saga full circle, right back to the primal fear of the fugitive blacksmith running from his debts. The massive crash of 1929 didn't just shatter the stock market into 1 million pieces, it completely silenced the heartbeat of Moline, killing the vibe of the entire town. You have to understand, for nearly a century, the rhythm of the Deere family life had been set by the constant thumping of trip hammers and the deafening roar of furnaces down the hill. But as the Great Depression swept across the American landscape like a plague, the orders for tractors and ploughs didn't just dip, they completely evaporated into thin air. The farmers, who were the absolute lifeblood of the company, were destitute and broken while their fields were literally turning to dust before their eyes. And for the first time in generations, the giant smokestacks below the Overlook estate stopped breathing fire, leaving the family in a cold, terrifying stillness. The silence that fell over the valley was heavier, creepier, and far more terrifying than the industrial noise had ever been in the history of the dynasty. Charles Deere Wiman, the grandson of the Iron Titan himself, found himself standing dead centre in his own personal nightmare, watching his legacy crumble. The paralysing fear that had once driven the fugitive John Deere to flee Vermont had returned from the grave to haunt his great-grandson in the most poetic way possible. The company was bleeding money at an alarming rate, and the board of directors was in a total panic. But Charles, he refused to wave the white flag. He sat in the library of that massive mansion surrounded by leather-bound books and the judgmental portraits of his ancestors and made a shocking decision that would define his legacy forever. He absolutely refused to lay off the core of his workforce, deciding instead to keep the factory running on nothing but fumes and sheer willpower. When the company literally ran out of cash to pay the men, he famously issued them checks that were essentially IOU notes, backed by nothing but the honour of the Deere name. He bet the entire fortune, the sprawling estate and the entire future of the family on one incredibly risky roll of the dice. He staked it all on the desperate belief that the American soil would eventually yield fruit again and save them from total ruin. He spent those dark, terrifying years pacing the floors of the Deere Wiman house like a caged animal, a prisoner of his own crushing responsibility. The stress was absolutely corrosive. He aged rapidly, his face taking on the gaunt, hardened look of the exhausted men who had come before him. The house was no longer a place for wild jazz-age parties or social climbing. It had become a bunker under siege, with lights in his study burning until the crack of dawn. It was a lone beacon on the hill, signalling to everyone that the captain was still at the wheel, desperately trying to steer the ship through a hurricane without capsizing. Miraculously, he succeeded, eventually pulling the company back from the brink of disaster and into the massive boom of the post-war era. But let's be clear, this victory came at a massive personal cost that money just couldn't fix. The grinding anxiety of those years, the sheer weight of carrying an entire city on his back, left deep, permanent scars on the family psyche that would change everything. In the years following the recovery, a major shift occurred. The tether that bound the family to that bluff finally snapped under the pressure. The noise of the factory, which was once the sweet sound of money, had become unbearable, and the soot, once the smell of success, was now just filthy pollution. The new generation of the family, perhaps realising that living inside a smokestack was a recipe for misery, finally decided to pack their bags and leave. They moved far away from the Deere Wiman house, seeking out quieter, posh neighbourhoods where the air was clean and the ground didn't shake beneath their feet. They abandoned the fortress, leaving the great mansion to stand empty for a time, a silent sentinel watching over a factory that no longer needed a king to babysit it. Eventually, it was donated for public use, transforming from a private residence of secrets into a museum and a centre for history that anyone can visit. Today, you can walk right through the heavy wooden doors of the Deere Wiman house and pretend you're part of the dynasty. You can stand in the dining room where the crystal glasses once shivered from the factory vibrations and imagine the tension at dinner. You can look out the windows at the view that obsessed Charles Deere, but visitors often remark on the strange, cold atmosphere of the place. It does not feel like a home filled with warmth, love and laughter. It feels serious, heavy and undeniably imposing. It retains the stern industrial gravity of the men who built it, with stiff furniture and unsmiling portraits staring right through you. It is a house that commands respect, but it certainly does not invite intimacy, proving that the legacy of the Deere Wiman estate is a complex tapestry woven from steel and sorrow. The scandalous runaway blacksmith didn't just escape the law. He birthed a legacy that actually pulled off the impossible, nailing the exact ambitious vision the fugitive patriarch had orchestrated from the very beginning. We are talking about a total rags-to-riches transformation that obliterated their poverty. They constructed a mega brand so iconic that you can't go anywhere on this planet without seeing it essentially feeding the entire world while they raked in the fortune. But let's be real, that massive green money-making machine came with a devastating price tag attached. Their private family life was completely hijacked by the business, leaving them with zero privacy and an existence that didn't even belong to them anymore. They might have looked like royalty, but they were absolute slaves to the steel empire they created. Sure, they forged a history-changing dynasty that screams power, but all that cold hard metal ended up freezing their hearts and turning them into emotionally distant tycoons. As you speed away from that massive estate and cruise down the hill, past those modern factories still pumping out those gigantic green status symbols, the ultimate twisted irony of their so-called American dream hits you like a ton of bricks. The original John Deere might have fled town to dodge a literal prison sentence, but his astronomical success just ended up constructing a totally different psychological kind of incarceration for every single one of his wealthy descendants. We are talking about a high society prison cell draped in crushed velvet and expensive Italian marble. It might have had $1 million view, but make no mistake, it was still a cage that trapped them in a cycle of endless expectation. While that famous plough might have conquered the wild prairie, the relentless demands of the factory absolutely shattered their peace of mind, destroying any chance of a normal, drama-free existence behind closed doors. And sitting right there on that quiet, isolated bluff in Moline, the massive house is still standing tall, looming like a silent witness to all the buried secrets and family drama that went down inside those walls. It serves as a gorgeous, tragic monument to the brutal truth of high-stakes empire building, proving that when you are chasing that level of power and legacy, the very first thing you have to sacrifice on the altar of success is your own peace and rest.